Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul O'Shea. I'm the Managing Director of Ashview Consultants. And as Claire has mentioned, there's Paul Feely, the UK Director for Ashview, and Paul Bussey from AHMM. So what we're going to go through this morning is a holistic view of design risk management and what a good strategy would be for an off-site or the precast or a modular build. So we're going to be alluding to a couple of different areas of the off-site construction. Paul Feely will go through the more detailed view of what precast design risk management and offsite looks and how it feeds into the construction process and whole management of risk. So what we're going to look at is what is design risk management and what is a good strategy. So what's a good strategy for your business based on the size, scale, services that you're providing. Design risk management, what's good versus bad. Good and bad examples of DRM or design risk management, the whole area of transportation and logistics. And we'll have a Q&A session at slide 7 and slide 13. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A section, as Claire has alluded to. You put your questions into the chat box and we'll deal with those as we go along. And please, look, ask as many questions as possible, because at the end of the day, there is a rule in asking questions that if you ask a question, they say 10 other people are thinking that same question. So for us as presenters on the webinar, it allows us to answer quite a broad area of the group, cohort of the group with one question. So please ask all the questions. So around the whole area of design risk management, what does it mean? It's where designers can demonstrate that within their designs how a building can be built, used, maintained, and eventually demolished without negatively affecting the safety and health and well-being of those involved in the construction process or those who might be impacted by the structure. So it's a very holistic view of the sort of design, construction, and future maintenance and deconstruction. Big buzzword out in the industry is the deconstruction and the whole sustainability around how we deconstruct buildings, and something that's finding its way into the process. I know, an awful lot of talk about commercial buildings being converted back into residential buildings. It's something that's popping up on the agenda now with the whole COVID and restrictions and the use of office space. So it's that whole environment from design, construction, future maintenance, deconstruction. It's not a separate process, so it's not design and construction. It's the holistic view and holistic approach to design. Project delivery tends to be more harmonious when design risk management is enshrined in the design process from the outset. So, there's some experts on this call today that will talk you through how early engagement, not just along with the contractor, but that is a vital part of it, early engagement with the designers, early engagement with the client and their expectation, and to have a look at how that all marries together. And, as a CDM or principal designer, where you sit in that process and how early you're in that process that you can use the word influence and engage and collaborate with the people around the table. And everybody's got some expertise to bring to the table. We've put up a couple of examples of sort of the good design versus bad design, and a couple of pictures there are, just typical of this, your precast off-site construction. On the left-hand side is a pedestrian bridge we were involved in, which was at a major intersection. That bridge actually returns across the major intersection and back down the other side. And obviously, a lot of restrictions around traffic, high volumes, main tributaries into the city. So obviously lifting, moving the machinery, restraints, the off-site construction process, the scheduling, are all major parts we had to consider when delivering that project. And as well as that, keep all the live tributaries into the city moving. So obviously a lot of planning went into the off-site part, a lot of collaboration, specialist input from the precast guys on the sequencing, the size of the panels, the size of the crane, the locations of the crane, less movement. So bringing, looking at design risk management for us on that particular instance was about bringing the permanent works designers, the specialist designers, the schedulers, the planners, the crane guys in to tell us what size of crane. So that whole collaborative approach to design risk management and ensuring that, as much we've got to build these objects, we've got to build the pedestrian bridges. So although we're looking at the design part, what's the constructability of it and the future maintenance as well. So what are the future maintenance aspects of this, where maybe a lighting locations, what handrail systems going in, whether there's joints that need to be inspected, movement joints need to be inspected, how they're all going to be inspected in the future maintenance part are critical to the collaboration process in design risk management. And on the right hand side is a picture most people on this call will be familiar with, where without getting into all the detail on it, but what came out of the investigation was that there was plenty investigation showed up, there was plenty of emails going between various parties to say that there was concern, but nobody adopted an authoritative position to say that you're the permanent works engineer, you're the precast offsite engineer, you guys need to be talking, there's something not right here. And we had a bridge collapse. Well, we didn't. There was a bridge collapse in the industry in America. And so, you know, that demonstrated one thing, that the strategy going to that project wasn't correct, because the evidence unfortunately was, now I know there was no fatalities and a couple of scares around injury, so they were very lucky. That could have been a full intersection, a completely different story when it came to the investigation. So what we're leading into is the whole what's right and what's wrong with a design risk management strategy. I suppose we can all concentrate on what's not good is and what's not right to having a design risk strategy is lack of competency on the task or process. Now, that's not to say that somebody that gets involved in the design risk management process or strategy is incompetent, but it's having the right people for the right job, for the right task, that have possibly delivered a project similar nature, size and complexity, that have been involved in that process. And Paul Feely's going to allude to, and Paul Bussey, about the specialist input in a strategy as well. So not to forget the specialist precast contractor who's got the expertise in delivering precast, and you've to tap into that as when you're putting a strategy together, that you tap into that expertise, be it that you know them from the industry, do you know their competencies. And this is not just about a tick box where we're, you know, the next point that we're saying about risk management being a paper exercise, but being able to extract the information out that benefits the project, that it's not just a list of items, that it's sorry, Paul, just go back on that, Paul, just on that slide. I just want to go through there. Yeah, and that it's not turned into a box ticking exercise, that your risk assessments aren't just gathering dust, you know, that they're just a generic copy and paste from a previous job. That yes, there's an element of processes that you will use on a recurrent basis, but that it's the right information for the right people at the right time in these documents, and they're not big cumbersome documents and strategies, because at the end of the day you want people to use them. And if you give somebody a 5-page document with specific information about a process, or a 35-page document with a load of fluff, what are they going to read, and what are people going to benefit that are in that strategy and looking at how to deliver the project safely? Generic and incorrect or inappropriate control measures, design risk assessments that are not they're site focused and not design focused. So they haven't looked at the mitigating measures. Quite often as CDM and pre-construction assessor, you see information that's not focused on the actual design, it's focused on a constructability issue that may not be able to mitigate, you may not be able to design out. And a competent contractor might ordinarily know that risk, and your job is to more focus on that design risk strategy, that you're ensuring that you can design out the actual risks that are applicable to the designer. No engagement of specialist contractors, so just ensuring that you're extracting the information from the specialist contractor, as we discussed earlier. No formal review or looking for solutions. So, you know, workshops, no formal workshops. So looking at bringing those people around the table. I know we're all living in the digital era now, where it's webinars and it's Teams meetings, Zoom meetings. It's actually easier to contact people now and get them around the table, having that workshop. So looking at it done correctly, then if we go to the other side, is where you bring in competent people that have delivered a project of a similar nature, similar complexity, similar scale, have expertise in it, effective risk solution and reduction. And as a CDM or pre-construction design risk manager, when you're writing the design, like acknowledging, we're very clear as professionals, we acknowledge where our competencies may be limited and where we may need to bring in somebody that has that expertise. And I think as a professional, it's important that you acknowledge that as well. Early engagement at pre-construction, so that you can benefit the process. You're influencing how the process takes place. You're advising the designers on the appropriate measure. You're advising on the design risk strategy, the constructability, the future maintenance, and the deconstruction part. Effective communication such as workshops, hazard identification through that process. Very important during our process that we can demonstrate elimination or mitigation of risk. So we're continually looking to evolve that cycle through the process, so that when we get to our like milestones such as tender stage or procurement of main contractor, that ourselves are not passing off a residual risk that ordinarily should be designed out, and that the contractor is, well, and I won't say accepting that risk, but then coming back to you saying ordinarily that risk should have been designed out during the process. And a number of those the guys will go through some of those later on when they get to the examples. And obviously consulting, as we said earlier, making sure that you're consulting with your specialist contractors and subcontractors. They've got a wealth of information, a wealth of experience and knowledge within their organization to help you during that strategy that you're looking to deliver the project. One, Paul. Click on there, Paul, that's fine. So I suppose the consequences then, the death and destruction of if we don't do it right. So obviously there's always the various duty holders, but we've got our legal obligations, we've moral obligations, and we've our economic obligations. Who does that apply? It applies to clients. Ultimately they're the duty holders for the whole project. They appoint all their competent people around them, be it your principal designers, your design team, your principal contractors, your specialist contractors. So everyone coming to the table, and I think it's taking that holistic view from a design risk management point of view, that every one of those people have a nugget of information when you're looking at your design risk strategy. And as a pre-construction specialist or a CDM, or in Ireland it's the PSDP, you have to ensure that you're bringing that all together in that strategy. If it goes wrong, injury, fatalities leading to prosecution, health and safety failings which lead to pain, suffering, and misery, human consequences for not managing risk correctly, increased costs and possible fines, public opinion and lack of morale within the organisation, and could include members of the public. You know, the public themselves can be affected by what goes on in a project, and all this can be avoided with a fairly robust design risk strategy. So I have a couple of questions that I'd like to bring two Pauls in. Excuse me, they're all Pauls on this morning, so Paul Feely and Paul Bussey. But for Paul Feely, just on what we've discussed there, Paul, with the whole design risk management, you're going to go into the whole precast offsite construction. What do you see as the critical items to the offsite design risk management strategy that you see in the precast industry?
Well, as Paul had said, I'm looking at this from a unique perspective, from a specialist subcontractor, and namely precast. So for me, it's really early engagement. So early engagement with the specialist subcontractor, that allows, because they have a very specific set of risks, and how them very specific set of risks tie into the specific risks on site. Given an example, you could have a crane in the middle of a city centre, that if there's no communication between the precast manufacturer and designer and the contractor on site, that crane could maybe only take, say, 5 ton at the end of the jib. But if there's no communication, the precast contractor will design that panel for as large as he can, and could design a 10-ton panel. And then when you get to site, you haven't the right crane. So really engagement at early stage between the designers, and then that feeds through to the manufacturer and the transport to site, and then for a smooth project on site. So the key thing for me really is, a specialist subcontractor, early engagement.
Could I add there, Paul?
Yeah, go for it, Paul.
I was going to say, so I'm certainly very keen on getting this early engagement, but that obviously means client appointment at early stages, or making a pre-contract service agreement to get that sort of specialist advice, because it might well have not been tendered at this stage and we're still going through a design process. So that's where things can fall down a bit, because it's great to have it, this early engagement, but if you haven't got the legal issues in place, then they might come in and give you perhaps inadequate information if they haven't got the job yet. So that is a very much a client requirement to buy into this process.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's a very valid comment. And I think, from all of our experience around it at the table, around the computer, is that sometimes the clients don't understand that. And so during the brief stage, like as a pre-construction specialist, your brief and who you're talking to within the client circles and their representatives, very important that they understand, one is get the early engagement of pre-construction specialists, be it CDM or PSTP, whatever it be, getting us on board. That's critical to it as well. And then the specialist contractors information. Absolutely, and that it brings it on to that subject of where, designing something's one thing, but actually delivering it and constructing it is another thing, and the understanding of the constructability process. So, go back to what we said about competency and sitting around the table. It's very important that the people that are sitting there have that information, as Paul Bussey has alluded to, and brought it to the client, that we're going to need this input, and who is going to give it to us, and what contractual T's and C's are in place to bring these people in front of us, and do we need to get multiple options here so that we're getting a balance on the approach, that we're not just getting XYZ precast company because that's the specialist system that they have and they're going to sell that to this project, because that's another element to that as well. Paul, just on a question for yourself, just from a principal designer role or CDM advisor role, how do you see specialist designers providing information to the design team and contractor? I think it alludes to what you said earlier, but if there's not early engagement, is there options as a pre-construction specialist?
I like what you said earlier about the fact that you get the specialists of specialist contractors should know their game implicitly, so they should be able to mitigate the routine, normal day-to-day issues, cutting bricks and blocks perhaps on site where it doesn't quite fit or whatever. But obviously we're trying to look at the bigger picture and what we call the significant CDM issues. I don't like to call them risks because they're benefits and risks at the same time. So they are multifactorial issues, not just what we call one-dimensional risks. So the whole logistics, as you mentioned, the transportation requirements, the size of the panel. On various projects, we have small or low bridges to get the panels onto site. So that constricted the size of our precast panels. Then, as you say, the crane. How many cranes, where are they? Are they capable of taking that size of panel? So all that has to be fed into the design initially. Then that can have an effect on the original planning application, which happened months ago or even years ago. And so that interface is a very difficult process and needs to be done progressively throughout the job, through the work stages, and make sure we revisit the size of those panels. And I think we were talking earlier that some sites, they're adjacent to transport corridors. That particular elevation might need a different size panel to other elevations that are much more easily accessible by a crane and don't have such public interfaces at the base. So all that is a holistic design process. Has that answered your question?
Absolutely. Listen, like that essentially, we'll talk about design risk management strategies and the word holistic and the word cycle. We've all been saying those words, and that is, it's a cycle of design, constructability, future maintenance, but it's not one particular proverbial silver bullet that solves everything, and it's a multitude. And I suppose that during that cycle, that the people that you can reach out to with the nuggets for your strategy are very important, and that's where, you know, us as professionals getting early engagement in the design process is critical. And thankfully, you know, I know ourselves, we're seeing a lot of clients understand the benefits of that, because not alone are they looking at the financial risk now, they're looking at the future use and the future maintenance of the building, and they want jobs now that are pretty much construction risk adverse, which I know is impossible in the big scale of things, but to the point that they're going to site, and we talked earlier, myself and Paul were talking earlier about design and build, you know, that it's going out for your design and build contract, and the contract gets on, and there's a coordination exercise after that. But very good, yeah. So we'll move on, and so I'm going to pass you off to Paul Feely, and Paul's going to take you through some very good examples of the whole offsite. So without further ado, Paul, take over there.
So a brief background of myself: 20 years health and safety experience, 10-12 years of that, and specifically offsite and precast, and as the chairman of the British Precast Safety Steering Group for 3 years, so involved in writing codes of practices, design best practice within precast and interface. So I'm going to take it through a few specific examples where good design risk management has led to successful projects. So the project on the left is a lift shaft, and involved in that lift shaft, that's a very specialist design. There's very specific grouting procedures for the construction, curing times, and how all that's dealt with from a design point of view. Obviously, a large part of temporary works design, and how the temporary works design coordinates and feeds into the permanent design. And there's obviously coordination of other trades and logistics. So this core will go up, and then there'll most likely be a steel contractor that will come in and tie his frame around that. So it's that whole coordination to site, and the coordination between the design at the early stage, because there may be loadings coming off some of these stir and lift cores and so on. So very important, the coordination at that stage. Obviously on the right, this is hopefully none of us ever come across this here, but this is obviously where there's been a breakdown in design risk management. Actually, the building itself looks pretty intact, but obviously the foundations and the permanent works, there's been issues there, and clearly poor communication. So moving on to a few other examples. So this is a very specific where designers can reduce risk on work on site. So this is a steel angle that can be bolted in. The picture on the left is a steel angle that can be fixed in the factory and cast into the panel. And when that's done, and the manufacturing team are notified by that through the drawings and through the design process, they cast that in on site, and then this prevents the photograph on the right hand side. So these cases have bolting this bracket in. This will prevent that. It prevents obviously the work at heights and prevents lifting operations. So that's an example of good design risk management, preventing risks to the construction team on site. Again, this is another one, so where windows and doors have been installed in the factory. So the factory environment, in the panels on site, obviously the windows and doors can act as edge protection. And again, early engagement, so we have coordination, a lot of coordination between the client here, the principal designer, the window and door contractor, and the precast contractor. So that there has been, so what you want to avoid here is doing this wrong, and not getting early engagement means these panels would go to site and you miss the opportunity to install the windows and install the doors. And then obviously putting these in will reduce the need for work at heights on site, makes it safer, and reduce the need for scaffolding. So again, as I was saying earlier, the early engagement is really important in this part of it, and it'll tie into the whole holistic process of it.
Sorry, Paul, could you go back to the previous slide? I was going to say, I just didn't quite understand, not that one, the one before, because they seem to be related. This angle, are you suggesting that's fixed to the top of the panel to help lifting?
No,
I didn't quite get that message. So
that bracket is put inside, and then when that goes inside, flooring will come off that. So that's a wall panel up there. Then brackets are then led, so hollow core flooring will span across that. So
right. So where the guys are on the ladder, it's already cast in. The floor panels can be lifted in and just sat on that angle.
Sat on that angle, but if you don't cast the bracket on site, the angle in the factory, the guys actually have to get up the ladder on site and cast them in. So if you're casting that in the factory, it reduces that risk for the site team. install them
Excellent.
brackets.
It's interesting because sometimes the pictures don't quite give the full message, and you understand it. That's why I like to ask what might be seen a stupid question. But thanks for helping me with that.
Yeah. So again, that's reducing the risk for the site teams. So this is actually out of the precast flooring code of practice. So it's showing beam restraints. So the risk in this is if the precast installers and the guys installing it load out one side of the beam. So if there's 2 or 3 planks on one side of the beam can rotate, and then the beam and the slabs can come down on site. So the industry as a whole recognize this as a hazard and a risk, and issued guidance within their code of practice. Obviously, this is tying in with the temporary works design and the permanent works designers and so on, but it's really torsional restraint. And the message really here is communicating this to the guys on site through the notes on their drawings, through the method statements and so on, and as I said, tying in with the principal and permanent designers. Again, good communication here, and this was something that the precast industry picked up on and put into their code of practice. So I'm again just on them few points, really just going to go through a few questions. And Paul Bussey, I know we spoke about it earlier, about precast and specialist designers, and how do you feel is the best way for them to communicate that we're really getting a handle on these risks to try and make it as safe as possible?
Well, apart from early engagement, it's actually sitting down and looking at drawings and having other consultants in the room as well, like the structural engineer, the someone within the contractor organisation who actually perhaps has experience of the on-site activities. And often you get a contractor's input coming from a commercial type person, which isn't really of much benefit, to be perfectly frank. So we need to get the men who are doing this work, and often they're the ones with knowledge in their hands, as we call it, who can actually bring that to the table. So we're very keen to try and get that sort of. I used to work with a lot of site agents who came from, say, a bricklaying or carpentry background, and they understood the whole industry. They understood the welfare. They understood how we finalise the job. They understand the works in the ground and how everyone relates to each other. We've lost those key individuals in the industry, unfortunately, because people are more management contractors, and unfortunately that has eroded that knowledge. Getting back to that position would be useful.
Yeah, no, agreed. Paul O'Shea, then, just in relation to how the information is documented and communicated then to the site teams.
Yeah, I think Paul just alluded to there. The loss of information around the table is something that the industry is suffering and has been for a couple of decades in relation to the person who knows the sort of constructability parts and the information parts. But look, I suppose from my point of view, drawings and workshops, collaboration, early engagement, critical, how information is documented. Your design risk assessments come out of that. I think as design risk management goes, having a flow between design, construction, and future maintenance, and anything that you document is very important, so that you are, as a designer, or sorry, as a design risk manager, you're documenting where this is going. So if something can't be designed out, has it made it to a construction risk? And if it's a construction risk, or has it made it to a residual risk for future maintenance? That is very clear about ownership around that, and possibly getting input from a designer on that. So your drawings, workshops, DRAs, obviously the operation, safety file operation and maintenance manual then. So that's the construction work, but then when it's handed over and the duty holder, making sure that the right information is there for the right people to use on the maintenance of the building. And so that feeding, I suppose we're all very familiar with the golden thread of information of how the end user, the duty holder of the building, can maintain the building safely as well. So we can all talk about how it can be designed and constructed, but how the building can be maintained safely is a vital part of this as well. And I'm sure we can all agree that sometimes when the value engineering exercise that starts to take place in the project, sometimes the future maintenance aspect of the building starts to get the proverbial axe and you as a design risk management strategist or pre-construction or CDM, where you've got to dig your heels in as to how that future maintenance will take place and what information will be in the safety file O&M. So the drawings, workshop, DRAs, and how the actual information at the end for the duty holders of the building.
If I could add there, Paul, I think one thing you mentioned earlier was this cycle of review, and that's something what we've picked up at the RIBA, that the way you design buildings is what we call an iterative spiral, and slowly it gets down to smaller and smaller to the final design intent. But at every work stage, you have to kind of revisit some of your earlier decisions. Are they still valid? Is it still in budget? Which is obviously important, but in a value engineering sense, it's got to be from a quality perspective, not just get rid of the cost. And those are very important aspects to develop through the job. So an iterative spiral, revisiting things and re-questioning, do we want to go precast? Is it relevant? And sometimes you then revalidate that decision, or you say, no, actually, probably on-site, hand-built, although you might not want to hear that, Paul Feely, but actually that might be more appropriate for this job. And the client's going to make that decision, not be led down by the path of precast just for the sake of it. Now, I'm keen on precast, but there are other issues that come with that. Big bits of kit being transported around the country on our smart motorways, which we hear this morning aren't so smart, and you actually end up with lots of vehicle crashes. But those of you who have come across CLOCs, which is construction logistics and site safety in the community, how we can avoid people getting knocked off bikes by massive trucks coming into cities. So that might be a management of trucks and getting better visibility from the cab, or containing them to certain times of the day. But these are things we haven't quite worked out in our industry yet. I've just widened the discussion a bit there, I'm afraid, guys.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right.
Yeah,
Like, precast doesn't fit every situation, and it's down to the specific project and as you say, Paul, the coordination and logistics of it, and program as well. But no, and so just to close this bit of the discussion point off, what is it, Paul O'Shea? What have you seen as the best way that handing over information to the client for their specific building? What's the best examples you've seen that in the CDM file?
Look, go back to very early on in the process, the client's expectation. I know that early engagement, the client, and what they expect to see. So we have what the regulations say, right? That's what has to be handed over, right? But from a usability point of view, we have to be aware of what can be used, and a lot of this stuff is feeding into the handover file about asset management, obviously with all the working parts of the building, and then you've got the structural part of the building, how certification can be accessed, how drawings can be accessed a lot quicker. So I suppose the whole CDE, your common data environment, and the digital formation of the safety file O&M for handover is very beneficial for the duty holder of the building, because obviously everything can be accessed quite easily. You can update certification, you can add revisions very easy. So I think, to summarize, what I would see is the digital formation of a safety file and it's handed over can be quite beneficial. It's the best benefit for the end user because of the accessibility and functionality of it. Yeah. And
it's certainly, as you say, the golden thread of information. It's certainly a key point at the minute, and where the whole thing's moving. So no.
Can I add there, Paul? Go ahead to that.
Yeah.
And certainly, we're at the RIBA. We're talking about this golden thread, and there's a golden thread of information for the client to understand his building and take it forward. There's also a golden thread of information that demonstrates the design process and how that design process originally evolved. What regulations were we using? Because these days, in the fire world, there's some 850 different sets of guidance that relates to fire regulations, not just approved document B. I don't know what you have in Ireland, but certainly that's the case in England. And it's actually almost impossible on various projects to fully backtrack which bit of guidance you were using. So that golden thread is something that's very important now. We're seeing from fire, but it also relates to structural design, relates to sustainability, and all the other sections of the approved documents. So again, I don't know, the building safety bill presumably doesn't apply to you in Ireland quite the same way, but I think you're ahead of us, actually, from what I understand, in those respects. So I'm very keen to get information at that early design stage on drawings, on things that are visible and can be discussed, not in written narrative risk assessments, which are very difficult to interpret. They're only understandable by one or two people, and you can't discuss risk assessments in a design team meeting forum. They get too complicated because they're too multifactorial. You can discuss cutting bricks and blocks because they're single factorial issues, but a multifactorial building substation, electrical substation removal, temporary substation, and its final relocation is a very complicated process. And you can only discuss that on a site plan and a section of the drawing. So that's just a microcosm of how I think that the design stage, it needs to be it can be a digital 3D model, but that also needs to have its two-dimensional cuts, which help us understand it in plan, section, elevation as well. And often clients that can't use that long term, but the design team have to, and it needs to perhaps evolve then into something that clients more familiar with later on down the line. So this is still work in progress, to be honest, in the industry, I would say.
No, that's
Absolutely.
great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so just as we're just following on from now, we're going to talk about safe transportation and handling and logistics and site planning. So as Paul said, you're moving large pieces of precast about, and there's a perception with some parts of industry that that's the driver's responsibility only for the safe transportation of loads, and this is the HSE's guidance. It's important to remember that drivers are not the only people responsible for the safety of the vehicle and the load. The consigner and those in control of sites must ensure the loading is carried out safely and the load will remain in a safe and stable condition until it reaches site. So again, and I back to this word, it's about early engagement. So when the precast designer is designing these panels, there's no point in the precast designer designing a panel at 17 or 18 ton that can't be transported. So he needs to design these panels for safe transport. The A-frames and the type of panels are the type of products used to transport the panels obviously needs to be designed. The design of the frames, the safe working load, the safe strapping of them, what type of trailers, sometimes maybe needs a step trailer, a panel trailer. So all this is really engaged really at the design stage, because as I'd said, there's no point in a designer, a precast designer or designer designing panels that can't be transported safely to site and causing a risk. So, and it's not just the duty of the haulier. So again,
can I say, Paul, can I go back to that diagram? Because I mean, I couldn't agree more, but it needs the specialist subcontractor designer who's familiar with the panels, size of the panels. Then we need to give him the site information about low bridges, or and a lot of our sites in London, we have a mews access or a small sort of building gateway getting into a very tight site. So all that information needs to be fed back to actually, and obviously the size of that trailer vertically and lengthwise, of course, but vertically particularly is an important part of that process. But invariably, that information is not available at early stages when the design is going on, and then by the time you get to the stage when you're talking to the contractor or the specialist contractor, it might already be too late. So how you get that to work together is a big challenge to our industry and doesn't work very well at the moment.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, just Paul on that, on two Pauls on that, just the on the transportation, and it's something that I know, the whole logistical part of the site, which Paul will allude to, and the pre-planning during the design risk management process or the pre-construction of how the actual site, the set down areas are going to look as well. So, the transportation, which getting the panel in as one, but then when it gets to site, how many trucks, is it just in time deliveries? Is it three 40 foots at a time, that the site is ready for that? But Paul will allude to that, as that's another element to it. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, no, so again, we're just looking at a good practice and poor practice. Obviously, the good practice is Early engagement, we know the weight of the panels, that the crane, we engage the crane company, the specialist subcontractor early enough, the ground conditions, and again, and it's not shown this, potentially is there a railway line at the back of the project, and does there need to be jib restrictors and so on? As Paul Bussey said, is there tunnels or is there bridges close to the job? So all these tie in, and this is where I see the specialist subcontractor tying in, the specialist designer tying into the overall design with the project. And really then there's communication with the site team, the correct sizing of the crane, the ground conditions is right to take the load of the cranes. And as the guys say, whenever the panels come to site, if they need stored on site, how are they going to be stored on site on a temporary state? Is it just in time? And the whole logistics and planning of that is vital to a successful project, basically.
So as you mentioned, Paul, the design of that piling mat underneath that crane or piling rig is fundamental to make sure we don't get what happens on the right. And that's not just the ground conditions, that is the design of that mat that's been designed by a structural engineer or a temporary works engineer. And it's often thought, oh, that's just compressed earth. No, that is an aggregate, it's a platform, and it can be 2-3 meters deep on very difficult sites. And that is often completely misunderstood, and we end up with what's on the right there as a consequence.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I suppose the craneage, and just to close on that, the craneage in the specialist installation there, where you have like a crawler crane coming in, and you may have actual tower cranes on the site. You may have, so you have a specialist contractor coming in to do his role, and then you've also got all the site operations going on around. So that coordination exercise that everyone's fully aware, because that whole area will be restricted for the installation process, and that forms part of your strategy. And as you said, the mats themselves and the piling mats, or the crane mats that have to go down, who's coordinating all that, so you don't arrive to a crane collapse, God forbid,
That's getting temporary works designers in early stages of projects which are already, the rest of the design might not be completed yet, but there's an advanced work contract which needs to be managed in an appropriate way, and that is not managed well in our industry at the moment, I would suggest.
Okay. And then,
and the mere fact when you talk about temporary works engineer, when maybe the full project hasn't been designed, sometimes can lead to a lot of call it conflict within the design team, because they don't foresee what you see, and you're only pre-planning down the road. You're looking at your pre-construction process, which is good. It's a competent person would. But I know, and I'm sure you can echo this, guys, that sometimes the PQS or the QS or cost consultant, whatever, suddenly start jumping up and down because you're talking about something that they're trying to pin to somebody else's mast for costs, or they haven't costed out, or they've overlooked.
So getting those early temporary works costs in is very important. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah. Go ahead now.
Getting them costed into the cost plan at an early stage is also a key component of the design iterative spiral.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thanks, man. And then really, look, this is really just an example of a logistics strategy, crane plans, and how it's thought out. And just really in summary, it's early engagement with a specialist designer as early as you can, specialist subcontractor that they can start looking at the size of panels, the shape of panels, how they're going to transport at the site. And as Paul Bussey touched on earlier, maybe part of the project can be done on off-site, but there may be specific risks to the project that you're actually going to have to bring in and do in situ concrete, brick layers, block layers, these type of things. So it's having that holistic risk review of the project and looking at it. And again, as I said, it's the early engagement with the principal designer, the client, the principal designer, and the specialist subcontractors. And when this is done well, it invariably leads to a well-run and successful project. Either Paul's, if you just want to come in here.
I love these diagrams. At an early stage, you can get a sort of a crow's eye view of the site and the understanding of how those cranes are going to oversail adjoining buildings, if there's a railway adjacent, and other public interfaces. And then on the left-hand side, really keying into what those other buildings are, Are there old people's homes? Are there schools? Is there a hospital which has a heightened level of risk in relation to the project? And we take these drawings very early stage, analyse them, and highlight these constraints to a contractor who might be just focusing in on his L-shaped site plan rather than the wider environment. So it's fundamental having this early logistic analysis, which some people just don't think is relevant until they get to site and find that they're shut down because the hospital next door can't operate as a consequence of all the vibration and noise or whatever it might be.
Or you can't get deliveries in at a certain time because there's a school there, and
Yep.
exactly, yeah, 100% right, yeah.
Yeah,
All of you.
I look the logistical planning now as a major part of the pre-construction assessment and your design risk strategy for the job. Again, it's important, and we keep alluding to this, that the competency of the people that are putting it together is important. And we, ourselves had experience where people have, put together drawings and they're not even, they can't function. You can't deliver the job on the information base because they may not have been given all the right information, or they may not have an understanding of construction processes. They're just logistical people, or they're just people that CAD people that can draw up a drawing effectively. So it's important that the information fed into this logistical plan is from competent people, and if there's stakeholders like the specialist subcontractor that can help out, or a competent CDM advisor, pre-construction advisor there, or a crane person can help you with some information. So yeah, very good.
I must say, I mean, a lot of this is actually, if you look at it holistically, is relative common sense. And this sort of talk about competent people can be a bit misleading. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that a hospital next door is a problem in relation to a construction site or an old people's home or a school. So, but often it's missed because people don't think it's relevant. So just bringing that to the table, and then it might well be that it's not a major consideration, but we've at least looked at it and we've documented we've looked at it in a light touch way on this site plan. And the residential properties have exactly the same issues. Really, and certainly often more. How do you maintain their peaceful existence whilst you're building slap bang against them, or over them, which sometimes happens as well. And that is really something that needs to be discussed with the client to understand his assets and his adjoining assets, and that's bringing everybody into the process.
Yeah, look, we couldn't agree more. Yeah, that it's true that sometimes it's just not considered, and I suppose we do allude to the word competency quite often in what we do. It is that common sense that to acknowledge that there's something. Let's look at it, and if it's not going to be it's not going to have an impact on the project, then we can strike it off. I think it is missed, Paul. Very, very valid comment. It is missed so much where people don't ask just. Asking a question that somebody around the table has an answer for. You might not have the answer, but there's a person at the table around you when you're looking at design risk strategies that has the answer. And
knows a man who can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think Paul, you touched on it earlier too. Has the contractor, has the designer been involved in similar scale and similar size projects, and that they've not went from £1 million job to a £50 million job, and they just don't have the resource or the competency to deal with that type of project,
Yeah, I think we all have to accept we're going to do a bigger project as we go through our careers, but perhaps too big a jump is a problem. I agree, but you can also, particularly architecturally, get in other designers who have had that experience within your team and develop that. So that is something we're looking at the RIBA to try and build this experiential knowledge that comes with years of work through the industry. You can't just give it at a school of architecture or in training initially, but it needs to be a balance of that training with some experience. So that's why architectural practices generally have a diversity of age ranges to help with that process.
No, very good.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So, Paul O'Shea, do you want to just close here, Paul O'Shea, in the summary?
Yeah, just in summary, I suppose we alluded to it earlier, and I think that it's great that the theme between us on this webinar has been about, project delivery tends to be more harmonious when the design risk management is enshrined into the design process from the outset. You know, I think it's shone through what we've all been discussing and bringing our expertise to this about, is that, you know, you need to have that design risk management strategy enshrined, and what objectives are, how you're going to get to them, and how you're going to close out what you've got to close out, and how you then document that through. And in summary, we've looked at what a good strategy is. We've looked at bad versus good, or good versus bad. We've had some very good examples of the off-site construction and how design risk management has been considered, and then the whole transportation and logistics. Very interesting thoughts from everyone there on the whole logistical part of it. You know, that, you know, the proverbial can is not kicked down the road to the contractor and it's put in front of them and said, there you go, deliver that project. That there's a process from day one as how this is going to be constructed and delivered. And I say the word delivered, meaning the whole project delivered and the actual logistical part of the transportation. So that's a very wide range of risks around that, and we need to consider them. Do you want to go on the last one, Paul?
Could I just add there? I mean, just
Yep.
certainly the IIRSM webinar which we deliver has a toolkit which we've developed at the RIBA, which helps principal designers and clients and design teams collate the right information at the right time, review it on a regular basis through drawings and analysis in a very visual way. There is a register that goes with it of the key issues, but that is like an executive summary. It doesn't go into massive amount of narrative detail. And we're actually visually analysing without by using the main project drawings, but capturing key snapshots of those drawings, the key issue about that substation or that tower crane. So we see it in context rather than just talking about a substation in our heads. And so by visually analysing it in the toolkit, we can go through the iterative spiral and come out with the end with a suitable solution for that particular multifactorial problem. And that's something we found very useful. It helps our teams to actually produce this information incrementally throughout the project, because you can't just come up with the answer at day one in one workshop by any means. You've got to go away, do some more surveys, talk to some more people, get some more input into this design, and then refine the design going through the process. So that toolkit is something that's work in progress in a way, but a lot of practices are now using it architecturally, and certainly I think there's a lot of health and safety type companies who could benefit from that, working with their own design teams.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
On to last. Okay, so that's it. I just want to thank all the Pauls, the three amigos, all the Pauls for the input today. I think it's been fantastic insight into all the different elements that are going around design risk management. It's obviously something we're very passionate about, all of us on this, and I think there's so many elements to it. So thanks to all involved, special thanks to the IIRSM, especially Claire, for putting it on the webinar. It's been great, and if there's any questions, we'd be delighted to answer them.
I'm not sure if we have any further questions coming through, although Trevor has asked about the toolkit. Is it applicable to all sectors, and where can they access it?
Well, I can answer that, Claire. You can access it through IIRSM, certainly, and through the webinar that we're having in a few weeks. But they have it available as well. It's also accessible on the DIOHAS, DIOHAS website. In terms of what industries it relates to, primarily we developed it from an architectural perspective, and we know that the building of bridges and infrastructure has a different process. So we're quite happy to hand that over to the Institute of Civil Engineers or others to deal with it however they want to. But it fundamentally relates to any architectural project, whether it be a small house extension up to the Shard or something bigger. But obviously at the lower end, at the smaller end of the industry, we're very much trying to just get information on drawings and perhaps have a small register that goes with that. So annotated drawings makes a lot more sense in that. So I think that covers quite a wide spectrum, but I'd never like to tell civil engineers their job.
Thank you, Paul. Just a final point from Peter, very well presented, and thank you very much, everyone. On behalf of IIRSM, thank you to you all for joining us today. I think it's really interesting. Just a reminder to everyone attending that there's some resources in the handout section, including an offer from Paul O'Shea and Paul Feely for a free 30-minute consultation, should you find that helpful, and their contact details are in there. So I think on that point, thanks everyone, and we'll now close the webinar.
Thanks
Thanks
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.